when I became pastor of the church that I serve, which is a Black church, there was not good community presence, but there was good community memory. The members had once lived around the church, a lot of them, and as economic conditions improved for them, or the need to live closer to where they worked, moved them from this area where our church is into other areas. And they maintained their commitment to the church and maintained their memory of the neighborhood, right? And so now we're driving into church. It's a small congregation because the church had gone through some splits about the time that I arrived. And they're driving in for Bible study and for choir rehearsal and for all the meetings, and are faithful in that. And in their mind, the neighborhood is the same. They just don't live in it anymore. When in fact, the neighborhood still had houses, and the houses were not unkempt or anything like that, but the neighborhood had changed drastically. The people who were in those houses were now renters, and the school next door was 85% free and reduced lunch. And if you paid attention to the neighborhood, you would notice that all of the family kind of gathering spaces have been closed down and been replaced with fast food places or pawn shops or check cashing places. But they had not noticed that, because sometimes we don't notice the water that we're swimming in. And so when I came, the mandate was, we want you to grow this church. And the questioner asked, how do you reintroduce the community to the church? And the path that I chose to take was to reintroduce the church to the community. So I had them meet me on a couple of Saturdays. I asked them, well, tell me about this neighborhood. I'd already done my research. I didn't live in that neighborhood, but I'd already done my research. And I knew the neighborhood, but I wanted to see what they were going to say. And they started telling me about the neighborhood they lived in. And I said, okay, well, I tell you what, let's meet up here a couple of Saturdays. And I had door knockers made about the church, inviting people to church. I said, let's just go door to door and introduce ourselves to the neighbors and get a feel. And it didn't take long for them to realize how much the neighborhood had changed, right? And so then we started talking about the statistics. And I did a series called The Door of the Church is Open. And I suggested that invitation need not just be a spiritual invitation, but a literal invitation to the doors of the church. And a challenge that if we open the doors of this church right now, that the people who would come into the doors from our neighborhood may not exactly look like the people who are inside. They may not have the education you have, and they may not drive cars like we drive. There's a bus stop right at our corner now, in case you didn't notice. They may walk in. Some of them may not come in with money to give to the church. They may come in needing our help. We did all of that and started our reorientation. So from that, we had a big church with a small membership, and the church was on board for opening the doors of the church after they found out who the community was. And we chose not to open the doors for traditional handout, which is needed, but there were churches already doing that. We chose to offer space. And so we offered space to neighborhood people who had ideas about how to improve the community at no cost to them, as long as they would serve the community at reduced rates or serve the community free of charge. And from that, this church that only had 30 members became the host to a robotics team. We got GED classes. We got a girls mentoring program. We got dance classes. These weren't people that were in church on Sundays. They came during the week and did these services. And from that, then the church members wanted to do more. So we became an incubator. We had a commercial kitchen. We began to incubate businesses. Our first one was a catering service. We allowed them to incubate for 3 years. And all they had to do was tithe off of the money they were making so they could build their business before they went out without a lot of overhead. We've done a couple of other businesses like that since then. And then the church began to see the needs of the community. So we had a lot of elderly people who didn't have computers. We opened a computer lab and we started computer classes for elderly people. But it was because the church reconnected with the community. And then the community came to the church. Right. And it was out of that connection, because we started doing funerals for, there was a lot of violence, and we started doing funerals for people who died that weren't members of the church. And because of one of those funerals, someone at that funeral kept my card and said, when Michael Brown died, said, "You've been my pastor since you did this funeral last year, and will you come and be out here with me in Canfield?" That's how I ended up in Canfield Apartments when I did, right? So I think that the church needs to reframe its mind from how can we get the church, the community, to be interested in us, to how can we promote a theology that compels us to be interested in the community, because the church really isn't in the buildings. The church is in the ministries that we do.